Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for our webinar on the new report released by the Center for Future Work about the coming impacts of the current oil shock on Canadian consumers and the Canadian economy. Okay, I think we've given enough time for the technology to work. I'm now going to pass the chair to our chair. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome D.T. Cochrane. DT has been working for some years at the Canadian Labour Congress. He's a fellow union economist, and I'm just so glad to have DT today as our chair, and he and I work together on a lot of projects. DT has quickly become just a very important progressive voice on economic debates. You've probably seen him on TV and in the newspaper, and we're very grateful, DT, that you'd join us today to chair our session. Take it away, DT. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jim. It's my pleasure. It's a great honor for you to invite me to host this webinar. Incredibly important topic, one that us at the CLC are paying a lot of attention to for the impact of the oil shock on workers who are also consumers. So welcome everyone to this webinar from the Center for Future Work on the enormous costs that we're going to face from the current oil shock. And I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm joining you from the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, who have inhabited and cared for these lands since time immemorial. I also want to mention that I grew up in Saskatchewan on the traditional territory of the Cree and the Blackfoot, which is subject to Treaty 4. And where I grew up, there's a large gathering each fall, the Treaty 4 gathering, which is really calling attention to how these treaties have been systematically broken. And I bring this up to remind us that the treaties were land sharing agreements. And I think this is important to keep in mind as we hear about how a global conflict is going to transfer billions of dollars from our pockets into the hands of oil and gas companies. And just like the treaties are often broken promises, so too has the promise of supposedly free markets been repeatedly broken. So today's webinar is going to present a new report titled "A Sequel We Don't Want" about the current spike in oil prices. And it's part of the False Profits Project from the Center for Future Work, which is examining the role that fossil fuels have played in the ongoing crisis of living standards. And unfortunately, just as we've been starting to reclaim the lost purchasing power that came from the bout of high inflation, now inflation from this latest oil shock is moving higher. Our speakers today, of course, is Jim Stanford, who most of you probably know is one of Canada's most prominent economists, a leading voice among heterodox, progressive economists, labor-focused economists, economists, I would say, with a sense of ethics. Jim is the director of the Center for Future Work. He's a former union economist. He's the Harold Innis Industry Professor at McMaster University. And he's also author of a really excellent book, Economics for Everyone, which is a primer on real-world economics, trying to understand the real economy rather than the fantastical economics that tries to understand the non-existent free market. Also joining us is Atiya Jaffar. Atiya is the Canada Country Manager for 350.org, one of Canada's leading climate organizers. We're going to begin with Jim, who will provide a summary of the report, and then we will go over to Atiya, who will tell us about 350.org's campaign for an excess profit tax on petroleum companies, because we saw during the last bout of high inflation that oil and gas companies reaped record profits on record profits. If you have a question, please make use of the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, you might have a more selection with 3 dots, and you should find it under there. So submit questions for Q&A through that function. And with all of that housekeeping in place, I'm going to throw it back over to you, Jim.
DT, thank you very much. Thank you for that generous introduction, and thank you very much for chairing our session today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a few slides. I'm going to run through the key findings of our report, which was released on Monday earlier this week, and that documents the impacts on Canada's economy from this latest shock in oil prices. So just give me a moment here while I fire up the slides. Hopefully you can see those. Okay, a sequel we don't want. What the 2026 oil price shock will cost Canadians. And the full report is available. We have a special website for our false profits project, an easy website, falseprofits.ca. And of course, there's a double entendre there in terms of profits and the profits, giving us the gospel of fossil fuel dependence. And the whole idea of the False Profits Project is to show how reliance on fossil fuels and the distorted market and corporate structures that go with fossil fuels has in fact been the key contributor to the affordability crisis and the cost of living challenges that millions of Canadians have been grappling with. And this is a part of the whole debate over affordability in Canada that just gets swept under the carpet. And so this project will extend over 2 years. This is our second major report. I'll mention briefly the first one. And please check it out and follow our future work to highlight how fossil fuels is actually making matters worse. The solution is not more fossil fuels. The solution is regulating them and eventually transitioning away from them. So this particular price shock, of course, is caused by what may be the most insane war in history. I don't know. War in general is insane, I think, but this one, you just cannot wrap your mind around it. Trump started this war clearly motivated by domestic politics. He's sinking in the polls. Of course, he's sunk a lot further since the war started. He's been grappling with the Epstein controversy. He's looking at a defeat in the midterm elections coming up in November. So, he hoped, I guess, that a distraction from all of that and maybe promoting a sort of rally round the flag mentality might save him. He also obviously hoped that he could kind of go in and go out and claim victory like he did in Venezuela with that act of aggression. But of course, Iran is a different thing entirely. Anyways, we're just in an absolute cataclysm. Those who've suffered the most, of course, are those who are on the front lines. Thousands who have died, mostly in Iran and Lebanon, but other countries as well have suffered casualties. And the disruption and destruction is going to continue, including in the global south, countries that don't have the purchasing power to try and protect their share of a shrinking supply are going to experience shortages of fertilizer and inability to grow food and literally a famine because of this misadventure that Donald Trump started. So the impacts, of course, you've seen on your TV. This is the Strait of Hormuz. At the top, the small channel of water that joins the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean. And either there's empty ships on the right-hand side of the strait waiting to get in, or full ships on the left-hand side waiting to get out. But despite Trump's military aggression and despite his repeated tweets that peace is at hand, he had another one yesterday saying we're in the final stages of negotiating an agreement with Iran. Most of those tweets are about manipulating futures markets and allowing his insiders to make some quick profits on the big shifts in prices that happen. But there's been no sign yet that the cessation of hostilities and the reopening of the strait to allow the tankers for oil, the liquefied natural gas tankers, the other ships carrying things like urea or fertilizer or chemicals that have all been blocked by the war. No anticipation that it is going to end soon. And that means that there's going to be a time lag, even if the war ended and the Strait of Hormuz reopened tomorrow. It would be months until these supply chains were restored back to their pre-conflict state. For various reasons, because of the delays in filling up ships in the Persian Gulf and then transporting the product to far off ports in Europe or Japan or China or wherever. There actually was a buffer period of several months or several weeks rather, before the last tankers that were filled before the war started actually arrived in those far off ports. So the kind of delayed impact of the war was a buffer for several weeks. But by the same logic, that means once the strait reopens, it's going to be several weeks before all those tankers can fill up and get moved. Secondly, there's been huge damage to export infrastructure in the countries during the war. Inventories around the world of crude oil and refined petroleum products have been drawn down dramatically and are now approaching minimum operating levels. So it's going to take time to refill those inventories. So things are going to get worse before they get better, even if one of Trump's tweets about the war ending and the strait reopening actually came true. And it is astounding that his definition of victory now is to get the strait reopened. Well, the strait was open before he started the war. So this, again, is just another statement of the irrationality and imperialism, frankly, of Donald Trump's misadventure here. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, we've got a good guide for what this is all going to mean because we went through something similar to this just 4 years ago in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine in February that year. And likewise, there was a big shock in oil prices. The oil price on the world benchmarks jumped above $100 US a barrel, roughly where it is trading right now, and stayed there for about 6 months. Now, the irony is there was no change in world oil supply from that war. Ukraine doesn't produce oil. Russia does, and I think some of the traders were worried that the war might disrupt Russian exports, but they didn't. You actually had a growth in world oil supply in the months after Russia invaded Ukraine. So it was all driven by expectations and financial engineering, not by an actual supply crunch. This time there is an actual supply crunch. Closure of the Strait of Hormuz has eliminated about 20% of world oil supply and significant shares of natural gas, chemicals, and urea. So that means, if anything, things are going to be worse this time than they were in 2022. We did a report last year on the implications of that price shock in 2022, and we added up the damage that was done to Canadian consumers. We came up with a big number. About $200 billion was the damage to Canadian consumers over the 2022 and the next 2 years from the direct impact of higher oil prices, the indirect impacts on prices of other goods and services, the cost from the high interest rates that were imposed to fight the inflation caused by high oil prices, and then the lost jobs and employment income from the high interest rates. $200 billion over 3 years, that's $12,000 per Canadian household. So that report is there. And we said at the end of the report, this is going to happen again unless we learn the lessons from it and find out how to disengage from that world oil market roller coaster. And we didn't learn those lessons. We have exactly the same energy policies and exactly the same monetary policies as we did then. It doesn't give me any pleasure at all to say, we told you so, but we told you so. And here we are 4 years later experiencing the same thing and likely a little bit worse. What is going to happen this time? Exactly the same chain of events. We're going to see an immediate increase in petroleum product prices, and everyone has seen that. Gasoline prices are one of the most transparent prices in the whole economy because they're posted in neon on every other street corner. And that's why it becomes such a topic of conversation. Gasoline is an important purchase for Canadian consumers, but it's not that important. But it is what everyone talks about at the water cooler when they see the price shooting to $2 a liter or higher. And the great irony, of course, is prices shot up within hours of the conflict starting in the Middle East. Even though the gasoline underneath that pump in the reservoir on the corner gas station had been there for several days, had been refined several weeks ago from Canadian oil extracted several months ago. So there is no connection at all between the gasoline that goes into a car here and the Persian Gulf. But within hours, the price started shooting up. Similar to diesel prices and home heating oil prices and other petroleum products. So that directly causes higher inflation, and we're already seeing that. The bigger damage is done by the indirect effects in all of the other goods and services industries in the economy, everything from airfares to delivery charges to the food, the produce that you buy that has significant transportation costs built into it. All of those prices are going to go up as their producers pass on their higher fuel costs. And then that is going to cause the Bank of Canada to jump in once again with higher interest rates. And that will cause another, or actually exacerbate the economic slowdown that we're already experiencing in Canada because of Donald Trump's tariffs. So we know how this movie is going to end, and it's not pretty. And we don't want to see this sequel. Now, this is a pedagogical moment because lots of people are confused. Why did the gasoline price in Canada shoot up because of a war on the other side of the world? And that's a good question to ask. And the normal mumbo jumbo that you get from free market economists and the lobbyists for the petroleum industry is it's supply and demand. It's a global commodity. There's nothing we can do about it. That's just how the economy works. And in fact, we should all learn about how the prices for petroleum in Canada are set. And it has very little to do with supply and demand, and nothing to do with Canadian supply and demand. That's because the prices for our petroleum are set on the basis of what happens on those world futures markets. Futures markets are not oil markets. You don't buy and sell oil there. You buy and sell pieces of paper, which are contracts for the future delivery of oil. And there's about 13 times more of paper contracts flying around than there is actual oil produced anywhere in the world. Most futures contracts are canceled before the time for actual physical delivery occurs. So they really are a financial market, not an oil market. But because of how the financialized industry has evolved, they are the key trendsetters for oil prices. And then for specific types of oil, like the oil that we produce in Canada, the price follows those benchmarks with adjustments for transportation costs, the quality of the oil, regional issues like what refining capacity is around, et cetera, et cetera. So our prices in Canada are set by what happens globally, not by Canadian supply and demand at all. And since 1985, when Brian Mulroney's Conservative government deregulated the petroleum sector, prices in Canada have closely followed what happens on the global market. And the fact that petroleum companies have the right to take that oil or that gasoline and refined products and sell it somewhere other than Canada is what gives them the power to charge those world prices, regardless of what it costs to produce here in Canada. And then on top of that, you get the signal that is sent by world crude futures market changes, combined with algorithmic pricing and the close coordination between different refining and retailing companies. That's why the price of gasoline can rise or fall by about the same amount at hundreds and hundreds of different gasoline stations within minutes of each other. So again, this isn't free competition. This isn't what competition looks like. This is what coordination looks like. And the fact that Canadian oil is abundant, first of all, we produce 3 times more than we use in Canada, and in fact sells for less than the world price for various reasons, including lower quality, but also regional refining capacity issues, doesn't save us a bit. That we have no benefit as Canadian consumers from the fact that Canada is a major oil producer. And this disconnect between what we do in Canada and what we pay in Canada really flies under the radar. This shows the connection, the close connection between Canadian gasoline prices in cents per liter. That's the blue line measured on the right. And the world benchmark price that our oil prices tend to follow. That's the West Texas Intermediate benchmark that's set in Texas and adjusted for the currency. So this is the price of West Texas Intermediate landed in Canada in Canadian dollar terms. And you see the two go very closely together. So the price of gasoline that we pay is determined by the price of oil produced in Texas as determined on world futures market prices. And we see that instantly when the world West Texas price goes up, the gasoline price goes up. It doesn't quite work that way on the way down, you may have noticed. When the war ends, okay, it's not like the price falls by the full amount that it rose within hours. Okay, it tends to take longer to go down. And you can see this in several episodes in recent history when the world oil price fell. Even most recently, late last year, the world oil price was very weak, but the gasoline prices fell, but partly and more slowly. So the motto is up like a rocket, down like a feather. That's how you can describe gasoline prices, but ultimately the link is clear to the world price of oil. Now, our study on what the impacts of this are going to be, we can't forecast the future, especially not with Donald Trump and his erratic 2 a.m. Tweets involved. But we considered three potential scenarios. One is what happens if the war ended today and the Strait of Hormuz reopened immediately. You could call that the best case, but it's still a bad case. What happens if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for 3 more months? That's a worst case. What happens if the strait remains closed for 6 more months? That's the worst case of the three that we considered. And in every one of those scenarios, even the best case scenario of the strait reopening tomorrow, because of those delays that I mentioned, the prices are going to stay high for several weeks. We assume 3 months more high prices even after the strait reopens. And that's kind of on par with what most of the other analysts are suggesting. So we explain in the report what's likely to happen to the world price, currently around $100 US a barrel. If the strait remains closed, it is going to go higher because the inventories are running out and the physical shortages of gasoline and jet fuel and other key products are growing. And then it will take some time after the strait reopens in order for prices to get back to normal. So we're measuring these scenarios over a 12-month period, starting with the start of the war. So these are all 12-month periods starting in late February of this year. And you see the three different scenarios there. Then we take those scenarios and we apply them to the economic starting point. Canadians spent about $50 billion on gasoline last year, another several billion on other petroleum products, including diesel and home heating oil. An important fact, consumers pay a lot, but industry actually pays more. Businesses in Canada buy almost twice as much petroleum as consumers do as an input to their own operations. And this is where these indirect effects that I mentioned are going to be quite important. Moreover, because industry doesn't pay the same taxes on most petroleum products as consumers do, the proportional impact of an increase in oil prices is bigger for industry. So not only do they spend more, but the price shock they experience is larger than the price shock faced by consumers for various reasons, including the taxes and the higher unit distribution and retail charges that we pay. So taking all those things into account and then just working the math through, it's like a plumbing exercise. You can estimate what the impacts are going to be on Canadian consumers from each of those three scenarios. And here are the key results. We talk about how much consumers would pay in direct fuel costs under each of those three scenarios over a 12-month period. How much they will pay indirectly once those spillover effects are encountered. And that's where we get these total numbers. If the Straits of Hormuz opened tomorrow, Canadian consumers would still pay $50 billion more over a 12-month period starting in February than if this war hadn't started. Just imagine what Canada could do with $50 billion, folks. We could pay for the expansion of pharmacare. We could pay for the expansion of dental care. We could completely cover the costs of national child care. We could invest in hundreds of thousands of units of affordable housing. That's what $50 billion would buy. And instead, we're paying this in extra charges, not because it costs more to produce this stuff, but because the way the system works, the companies here have the power to collect that from us. And the damage is much worse if the straits stay closed for longer. $100 billion over 12 months if they stay closed for 3 months, over almost $130 billion if they stay closed for 6 months. And this will have a big impact on Canadian inflation that we're just in the early days of. We estimated that the average inflation would reach over 4%, even if the straits reopen tomorrow. I think that's cautious. They could reach 7 or 8% if the straits stay closed for longer. So this shows the track of inflation in recent history in Canada and then what's likely to happen. And you see, this is the big spike that's still causing headaches in Canada, was the spike in inflation in 2022. This was 2 years after the pandemic. Some of it had to do with the pandemic, and inflation was starting higher in 2022 than it is now, in part because of the supply chain impacts from the pandemic, but also because of the oil instability that was experienced during the pandemic. That extreme volatility in world oil prices worked the other way in 2022 in 2020 when the pandemic was at its peak, because the oil price fell dramatically. For a while, the oil price on futures markets was negative. Get this, because of the speculative and very volatile nature of futures market trading. And on average for 2020, the price fell to about $20 US a barrel. So that seemed like a bargain for a while. The gas was cheap, but we weren't allowed to go anywhere. So what difference did it make? But then as the price recovered, even in 2021, just to normal, that caused inflation. So the short-term dip in oil prices didn't help anything in 2020. It actually made things worse. But the worst damage came with that invasion of Ukraine and oil prices shooting up above $100 US a barrel. Within 6 months, inflation in Canada peaked at 8%. Then, when the oil price started coming down after June, inflation started coming back down. And it came down as fast as it went up because of that link to the oil price volatility. And we spent the last 4 years trying to repair the damage from this spike. It caused a decline in living standards. It caused affordability crises. Workers, especially if they're unionized, fought back and won wage increases that eventually made up for that damage. Real wages are higher today in Canada than they were before the pandemic. So that's a huge testimony to our labor system in Canada and the determination of unions. But we're just repairing that damage. And then lo and behold, we're going to get another one. So this is what we've seen so far in 2 months. In 2 months, the inflation rate has increased by 1 percentage point. After the Ukraine crisis invasion, it increased by 3 percentage points over 6 months. And there's no reason at all to think that this is it. And I was astounded this week. The Statistics Canada released their report on inflation in the year to April. It was 2.8%. And lots of the mainstream people and even the Bank of Canada were saying, yeah, that's bad, but it's not going to go any higher. Why on earth would you look at this graph and say it's not going to go any higher? In fact, we're just getting started in terms of the impacts on inflation. If the straits reopened immediately, we're looking at 4%, north of 4%. If they stay closed for 3 months, we're looking at 6%. If they stay closed for 6 months, we're looking at 8 or 9%. Already, we're looking at a situation that's comparable to what happened in 2022. And if the strait stays closed for longer, it will be worse. The Bank of Canada is sitting there and getting its bazooka loaded. They have not increased interest rates yet, even though inflation is now at the top of their target band. They try to keep it at 2% within one or plus or minus 1 percentage point error of margin. And it's already at the top of that band, and it's clearly going to go through it. They haven't increased interest rates yet because they're saying that they're not going to act on the basis solely of an energy price immediate shock, but they will act, and they made this crystal clear. They will act as soon as they see the indirect effects spreading through the rest of the economy, and that is going to happen. So my guess is we'll see the beginning of another tightening cycle in interest rates happening this fall. And it will carry on for a while until that inflation is wrung out of the system. The Bank of Canada can't impact oil prices with its interest rate, given how we set oil prices on the basis of world oil markets. But they can suppress and, in a way, damage the rest of the economy so that we got no money to spend, in essence. And that will wring the inflation caused by oil prices out of the system. If they increase by 1 percentage point and that flows completely through to the effective rate paid by consumers, that's a $32 billion hit. So this is where the interest rate impact is going to be as bad or as bad as the direct fuel cost impact, and just makes things worse. You'll get less employment, less income, and we'll be punished again for a problem that had nothing to do with Canada. Now, of course, we've seen in the wake of the oil price shock, we've seen a big, loud complaint from conservatives and others that the problem is taxes and that government should get taxes out of the way. And the Carney government, unfortunately, bought into that argument to some extent with a holiday on the federal excise tax on gasoline that will last until Labor Day. The consumer carbon price, of course, as we know, is gone. That was Mark Carney's first act as prime minister. Now the excise tax has been lifted until September. The excise tax was 10 cents a liter and hadn't changed since 1995. So nobody can look at this and say the problem is taxes. The problem is world oil markets and the industry that profits from those markets. It is not taxes. So cutting taxes not only doesn't solve the problem, 10 cents is small relative to the 60-cent increase in gasoline prices that we've seen, but it also misidentifies the problem and distracts Canadians from talking about what the true problem is. Our gasoline taxes in Canada are relatively low, the third lowest of any industrial country. And assuming that government can somehow subsidize this problem by putting a little band-aid on is absolutely, absolutely wrong. And the problem with band-aids is they hurt when you rip them off. And this band-aid is going to get ripped off on Labor Day. If they stick to the plan, the 10 cents a liter excise tax will come back on. And by that time, we're going to see more of those inflationary impacts spreading through the rest of the economy. It's the worst time to increase gasoline prices by 10 cents. They should have done something other than this to try and help consumers. The other argument we hear from the oil industry, of course, is well, this proves we should have built more pipelines. And of course, there's a whole bandwagon effect happening again with Carney and the Alberta government, and the whole push for more pipelines is the solution for whatever ails you. And if nothing ails you, more pipelines are the solution for that too. So we're seeing a huge push to build more oil pipelines and more LNG pipelines. And this whole argument that that will somehow save us completely misses the reality of how energy prices in Canada are set. Energy prices in Canada for petroleum have nothing to do with Canadian oil supply and demand. It's all set by the world price translated into Canadian dollars. So we could produce zero oil, or we could produce twice as much oil as we do now, and the price of gasoline would be the same. So this idea that more oil pipelines will save us is completely wrong. For gas, it's actually worse because gas prices in Canada do not follow world prices because the export opportunities for the industry are limited. We have a lot of gas pipelines going to the US, but in recent years, the US has had a surplus of gas itself, so they don't really need our gas. And this idea that producing more pipelines, say to the West Coast, and selling natural gas to other countries will somehow protect us, it won't. It will have the opposite effect. Because we don't have those pipelines, the price of natural gas has been low and has stayed low in Canada. This is the graph from Statistics Canada's report this week on the huge increase in energy prices, causing the overall inflation rate to rise to 2.8%. Well, it's not energy prices in general, it's petroleum prices. Natural gas prices have actually declined in Canada. Even though they've spiked in the international LNG market, the Europeans and the Asians are paying huge amounts, $20 US per gigajoule, far more than they were paying 2 months ago. But that experience has not translated into Canada because the export opportunities for the industry are limited. And that gives great pain to the petroleum industry. They would love to see those bars for natural gas prices rising as quickly as they did for oil and petroleum products. But it has been a huge benefit, a huge protection for Canadian consumers. And the impact of LNG expansion on future gas prices is something that has not been discussed in Canada very much. We will have a report on that exact issue coming out. The other thing that's not like the others on this graph is electricity prices, steady as can be. And this was true in 2022 as well. Electricity prices were an oasis of stability while oil prices were going crazy. And there's a lesson in this, which is if you regulate prices, as we do in most of Canada for electricity, Alberta is the exception, but other provinces regulate electricity prices on the basis of cost of production, and where there are private producers, a fair return to the private supplier. Most of it's public, and electricity prices have not been the problem. In fact, the faster we get to electrification, the more consumers will be protected. It's not all bad news. It seems like a lot of bad news, but there are some champagne corks popping in the boardrooms of the oil and gas industry in Canada. Nothing like global war and chaos to increase the outlook for this industry. They set all-time profit records in 2022 with that oil price spike after Russia invaded Ukraine, a country that doesn't produce oil. Those records will be broke this year because of the closure of the Persian Gulf, a place that does produce oil. And based on our three scenarios, we see upstream revenue, that's on the extraction side, of the industry, growing by between 27% and 66%, depending on which scenario you're looking at. Their costs of production haven't changed. They're not going to increase wages for oil workers in Alberta. In fact, they're going to continue mechanizing production and laying off oil workers in Alberta. So don't think for a minute that this is going to trickle down. Some of it will go to government. The provincial governments in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland will see more royalties. Some of it will go to corporate taxes at the federal and provincial level, not much of it. It's certainly not a windfall for government. It's so ironic to see the petroleum lobbyists talking about this windfall coming to government from high energy prices through royalties and taxes. They spend 360 days out of the year lobbying to get rid of taxes and royalties. And now they're saying, isn't this wonderful? It's going to be a windfall for Canadian governments. Not so. There will be some new revenue, but not much. And governments themselves will have higher costs because of the higher inflation and the higher interest rates that are coming. So government in general, other than the three petroleum provinces, government in general loses from this, just like Canadians do. So these profits are not from supply and demand. These profits are a transfer of money from our pockets to theirs. Here's our forecast of what the impacts on upstream revenue would be for the oil and gas sector. $65 billion more revenue this year, even if the Strait of Hormuz reopened tomorrow. This is revenue. Much bigger increases if the strait stays closed, which they're all probably hoping for. The last question we address in the report is how do we stop this from happening? Why we've explained why we go through this enormous, painful cycle of high prices, inflation, reduced living standards, high interest rates because of something that happened on the other side of the world. It happened in 2022. It happened other times before then, and it's happening again now. Can't we learn this lesson and get off the roller coaster? Well, we can, and it just requires some changes in policy settings because these aren't economic laws of nature explaining what's happening, they're policy choices. Change how domestic oil prices are set. Many countries around the world maintain regulations on oil prices, just like we do on electricity prices and natural gas distribution charges. So that's not an unheard of utopian idea. And we can certainly improve the stability of these prices. Secondly, this huge flow, this windfall that is going to the oil and gas sector, in large part because of higher prices, can be captured and redistributed. And this is where Atiya's campaign for excess profits tax is so important, and we'll hear from her in a second. Third, we have to think about how we manage inflation. The monetary policy regime has one big hammer. It's called the interest rate. And when all you have is one hammer, everything looks like a nail. So even though the Bank of Canada can't control the world oil price in the Persian Gulf, they can take out that hammer and start hitting us on the head with it again, which means that we'll be so damaged and our purchasing power is so reduced by high interest rates that that will offset the inflationary impact of this shock from the other side of the world. There are far more effective and far fairer ways to try and manage inflation than just this unidimensional reliance on high interest rates to squash us, whatever the cause of the inflation was. Finally, and the no-brainer, the hashtag duh moment, the faster we get off of fossil fuels and accelerate the transition towards renewable energy, the safer we will be. Now, all of those are very controversial policy reforms, big big changes in direction, and they will all be resisted fiercely by the status quo. First and foremost by the petroleum industry, given how much money they're making from this current state of affairs. So we can try to change it, and Atiya's campaign for the excess profits tax is a great step. But regardless of what happens, we should at least be honest about what's happening here. And this isn't supply and demand. This isn't commodity markets at work. This is about power and profits. And the fact that there's a very concentrated group of very wealthy people and the companies that they own that is profiting from war and chaos and our continued dependence on this source of energy rather than the abundant renewable energy that's all around us. That explains the mess that we're in. And that's what we have to challenge. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. DT and Atiya for your partnership in this. And I look forward very much to hearing Atiya's campaign for the excess profits tax. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jim. It's excellent work as always. As depressing as it is a eyes wide open moment. We need to be really honest about where these prices are coming from, where the impacts are going to fall, and how this is likely to result in, well, you can't really call it a recovery, but a K-shaped future trajectory for our economy because those higher revenues going to oil and gas companies will translate into money largely distributed to already wealthy people through higher dividends, share buybacks, whatever the corporations choose to use those profits for. Well, at the same time, it will be the most vulnerable people who are impacted the hardest by these higher prices. So, thank you for that overview. Really excellent work. Depending on the questions that folks ask, I'm curious about some of the technical aspects, but maybe we'll have that conversation ourselves since it's the more eye glazy part for a lot of people. Okay, so with that, we'll turn it over to Atiya from 350.org, who's going to tell us about their campaign for an excess profit tax. One of the tools that Jim has already mentioned could be used to address this problem. Okay, over to you.
Thanks so much. It's so eye-opening every time to hear Jim, and it's really hard to follow him, but I'll try my best. So I won't linger on this too long. We know that as a result of the illegal war on Iran, Canada's oil giants are raking in billions that they don't deserve and that they didn't earn. And based on a few different models, we can easily expect Canadian fossil fuel companies to make 50 to 100 billion dollars in excess profits. Every time gas prices go up, we know that big oil is squeezing more money from everyday Canadians. DT just spoke to this. That money is being transferred to the richest of the rich, and the outcome is that working people get poorer while executives and investors make astronomical profits. And I do want to just, for a second, also name the global crisis as well. When you zoom out and look at the global story, it's even sadder and more dire. CNN reported recently six of the world's biggest fossil fuel companies are on track to make almost $3,000 in profits every single second this year. And this quote from 350's executive director breaks down the problem perfectly. Oil majors will report astronomical profits, much of it earned on the back of a war that has already killed thousands and impoverished millions. Even if the Strait of Hormuz opens tomorrow, an obscene amount of money will continue to flow to oil coffers at the expense of ordinary people already struggling to afford fuel, electricity, and food. The problem is so clear, and so is the solution. It's time to stop war profiteering and return money back to families and communities. So, how do we do that? We have a tool right in front of us. We have the excess profits tax, and this is why 350.org is campaigning for an excess profits tax. We are calling for a 75% excess profits tax on fossil fuel companies. If, say, there are $100 billion in excess profits, that would mean $75 billion in extra revenue for the government. And imagine all the things that we could fund with that. But for one thing, we could fund direct relief to Canadians that are struggling under the cost of living crisis. So many families are feeling the pressure. We can also kickstart investments in infrastructure that will prevent this kind of crisis from happening in the future. So that means accelerating renewable energy projects and public transit, and investing in an east-west-north grid that is absolutely essential if we want to make the transition away from fossil fuel reliance and actually scale up renewable energy across the country. I just want to say that this is not a fringe idea. It's a clear, tangible solution to the crisis that we're facing, and it's gaining momentum worldwide. Most recently, Poland announced that it will implement a windfall profits tax on oil and gas companies to make investments to alleviate the weight of the cost of living crisis that's driven by skyrocketing energy bills. Portugal, Spain, Italy, Austria, Germany are all teaming up to raise a united voice for a windfall profits tax across the EU. The UK has had an excess profits tax on oil and gas companies since 2022 that they've extended to 2030. And the concept of a windfall profits tax is also something that has precedent in Canada. So we saw during World War II, the government actually introduced a 75% windfall profits tax across industries to prevent wartime profiteering. And more recently, in 2020, we saw a 15% windfall profits tax that was introduced on the financial sector to prevent pandemic profiteering. So there's a real opportunity for us to raise our collective voice, and we have a really good chance of winning as well. It's no secret that Carney has been upsetting the more climate concerned members of his caucus. All is not well within the Liberal caucus right now, especially when you look at the rollback of climate policy, the slashing of environmental protections, and the mess of this Alberta-Canada MOU, aka the toxic pipeline deal. This could be the excess profits tax could be a thing that we can build real pressure around in the Liberal caucus. So here's what we're asking people to do. Here's how you can participate in the campaign. You can email your MP. Our one-click tool makes it really easy. You can flood the inboxes of MPs across the country, and we've already had thousands of emails go out to MPs across the country. So we need to keep that going. We can also flood their phone lines. We've been making hundreds of phone calls to MP offices across the country. This is a way to exert even more direct pressure. And we have a click to call tool that makes it really easy to make a phone call. Our tool will even dial the number for you, and you can read off of a script. And I will put links to all of these in just a second. And the final intervention that we're recommending is that we flood the federal government's budget consultation process. Now, this process actually ends tomorrow. So this is a critical window for us to make sure that we raise as many voices as possible in support of an excess profits tax in this budget consultation process. So we've actually created a step-by-step guide that makes it very easy for you to intervene, and and raise your voice in support of an excess profits tax. So I'm going to put the links to all of these below. I really encourage you to save the links and take all of these actions. It would take a maximum of maybe 5 minutes to do all three of these things, but it shows that there's real popular support for an excess profits tax. And our strategy really is to create that downward pressure within the Liberal caucus to pressure MPs that can then pressure Carney. I will end by saying that there is nothing radical about a windfall profits tax. It's simply common sense, especially when you consider how much the fossil fuel industry has profited off of our plight. This isn't just about the last few months, it's about decades of profiting off of the destruction of our climate. When we talk about the cost of oil dependence, there is no bigger cost than the climate emergency. The math is simple. The current rate at which we're burning fossil fuels is incompatible with securing a safe climate. And the reality of the climate emergency is too real for all of us. We've seen it. We've seen it firsthand. Earlier this year actually marked the 10-year anniversary of the Fort McMurray wildfires. And in just over a month, we'll see the 5-year anniversary of the 2021 heat dome in Vancouver, where I live. This continues to be the deadliest climate event in Canadian history, where 619 people died from extreme heat, and we watched the entire town of Lytton burn down. These were not natural disasters. These were disasters driven by the climate emergency that is a direct outcome of our dependence on fossil fuels. And if we have any hope of protecting our communities and ecosystems across the planet from rising seas, catastrophic floods, out of control wildfires, and extreme heat, we need to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels. And to not be a total bummer, I do believe that there is hope. We are in the midst of a global power shift. As the cost of oil becomes more apparent than ever to the general public, the cost effectiveness of renewables is also coming into clear view. Wind and solar are the cheapest forms of energy on Earth. And Bill McKibben did a talk in Vancouver recently where he reminded us that the sun might be 93 million miles away from Earth, but it doesn't need to pass through the Strait of Hormuz to reach us. And Jim reminded us earlier that sunshine is not priced by speculative global markets that fill the pockets of billionaires. So in this moment, with the markets behind us, so are so many world leaders. We just witnessed last month the Santa Marta summit in Colombia, where for the first time representatives from over 50 countries convened to develop a real and tangible roadmap for a fossil fuel phase out. So the tide is turning, and Canada has a clear choice to either keep up our reliance on a dead end, volatile boom and bust fossil fuel economy, or move with the world and transition towards a just renewable energy transition. So I really recommend that you raise your voice in support of an excess profits tax and join us for our ongoing work to ensure that we can win a fossil fuel phase out.
Okay, thank you for that, Atiya. One thing I didn't mention is that prior to my time with Canadian Labour Congress, I was an economist at Canadians for Tax Fairness, and advocacy for an excess profits tax was a big part of what we were focusing on during the last bout of inflation, because we saw huge record profits going not only to oil and gas companies, but a lot of other corporations. So we do have time for Q&A. So I'll remind you that if you would like to pose a question to either of our speakers, you can do so through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I'm going to take host's privilege and ask the first questions of both of our panelists. And I'll start with you, Jim, and I'll actually connect it back to my mention of how record profits were realized beyond just the oil and gas companies, although they made the particularly gigantic profits during the last bout of inflation. So you mentioned the indirect costs that consumers are going to feel because energy prices are going to kind of ripple through supply chains and reach us at different times based on the products. And also, as you mentioned, there are other goods that flow through the Strait of Hormuz that are also going to have an impact on our cost of living. Urea, an important input into fertilizer, is a particularly notable one. Can you talk a little bit more about that kind of ripple effect and where we might start to see some of these higher prices appearing after they've appeared at the pump? Are there already some products where this is showing up? Where can we be looking? And how might we detect the phenomenon we saw last time, which wasn't just higher costs, but companies taking advantage of inflation to hike their profit margins? So they weren't just making higher profits off of these higher costs, they were actually increasing their markups on those costs.
Yeah, that's a very good point, DT. I think we're already seeing some of the spillover impacts. Airfares, for example, most airlines have increased their airfares because of jet fuel costs. If you want to get a package delivered now, there's often a fuel surcharge that's attached to it. Other industries that use petroleum products intensively include mining, agriculture, the chemicals industry uses a lot of petroleum products. Those are the places where you'll see the biggest, fastest increases. But eventually, based on the previous experience, you'll see them across the board. Our numbers, in a way, are conservative because we didn't build in any of that extra profit taking that you just described, DT. We certainly see the increased profits for the petroleum sector built into our numbers. But for those indirect effects that we simulated, we only measured the actual cost. So we assume that they will be passed on in full, but we did not build in an extra amount to reflect, in some cases, industries actually increasing their own profits at the same time as they're passing on the higher costs that they paid for petroleum. So if anything, those indirect effects could be worse. Now, the comparison to 2022, of course, is complicated by the fact that there was the pandemic at that point, and there were the supply chain issues in many areas, building products, automotives, semiconductors, etc. Those were other supply affected industries where the profit margins went up a lot. You mentioned fertilizer this time. That will exactly happen with fertilizers. How much it happens in other industries remains to be seen. But I think our numbers, if anything, are conservative, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's always the safe bet to make, be a little bit more conservative with this, because already probably some of these numbers are going to get accused of being doom and gloom. And in the past, when you've made these kinds of predictions and they've proven to be conservative, the people who said they were doom and gloom never come back and say, "Oh, our apologies, we were incorrect." It's a shocking pattern. Okay, over to you, Atiya. I want to actually shift a little bit and I guess put on my union economist hat. So a lot of, as Jim mentioned, these profits are going to flow to oil and gas companies, and they're not going to translate into more jobs for oil and gas workers. The biggest evidence that the oil and gas sector in Canada is effectively dead, despite the calls for more pipelines so we can expand, is that there just simply is no investment in production in Alberta. It's really winding down. Workers in Alberta, nonetheless, this is still an important source of income for them. If you work in that industry, this is a pretty good paying job, and people understandably want to hold on to those jobs. We know a transition is coming, one way or the other. What can that transition look like for those workers specifically and the communities that they live in who have become dependent on the oil and gas sector?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such an important question, and it's something that we have to take into consideration when we're embarking on a just transition to a renewable energy future. We have to ensure that no workers are left behind. I really look for inspiration to organizations like Iron and Earth. Iron and Earth is an organization that is fossil fuel workers that are actually leading the transition and trying to actually define what the conversation around just transition looks like. But some things that we need for sure are massive retraining programs for oil and gas workers. We need investment in industries that we know are really excellent employment industries. For example, energy efficiency inside homes, renewable energy generation. We know that we need to build an east-west-north grid that is actually essential for ensuring that we're improving our collapsing transmission infrastructure across the country, but also we're creating a pathway for provinces to better share electricity across provincial borders, which will massively allow us to scale up renewable energy production. All of these things will require workers, and it's really essential that we see the government investing in the kinds of programs that will allow workers to transition their skill set towards the industries of the future.
Yeah, thank you for that. And this, I guess, was one foot into the first question that we have in the Q&A, which comes from Thea. How can we bring climate justice back into discussions about oil shocks in the face of rising protectionism? I'm going to also append to that a little bit of the difficulty that is in what you're talking about, Jim, that you're talking about Canada setting its own path on how we're going to price energy and potentially other goods when the lunatic to the south has turned a sort of economic nationalism insularity into something of a laughing stock. So those of us who recognize that there is a role for us to exercise our sovereignty can start to get lumped in to, oh, well, you're just like him. So how do we make climate justice in the context of exercising our economic sovereignty part of this discussion?
I think I'll bow to Atiya and her judgment on how do we maintain attention to climate issues, which are really, in a way, being downplayed right now because of the economic uncertainty that people feel. So I think we have a challenge to remind people that the climate is the ultimate challenge we're facing here. As the economist, I try to just, rally some of the economic arguments on our side to show, yeah, it's bad for the climate and it's bad for the economy too, by the way. But I certainly accept that it is bringing the climate change concern back into the discourse that ultimately will be essential and ultimately we'll have to do to mobilize the pressure on the government to stop where they're heading right now. Atiya, you've got more thoughts on how do we talk to Canadians about this and give them hope as well as concern.
Yeah, I think, we know that the majority of Canadians still do care about climate change. 75% of Canadians continue to have climate change as a top issue. What is really important for us is in this moment to ensure that we're not letting the fossil fuel industry and their friends in office pit climate action and affordability against each other when we know that those two issues are intrinsically connected. Climate change is an affordability issue. If your house is flooding and insurance companies won't even be able to support you with the damages, that is an affordability issue. When we're breathing in wildfire smoke into our lungs and we're experiencing the health impacts for that's a health issue, that's an affordability issue. We need to ensure that we are as we're making the transition away from fossil fuels, that we're ensuring that justice is at the center. So, ensuring that we are the kinds of solutions that we're pursuing are also the ones that address top concerns for Canadians, including affordability, that actually make life better for everyday Canadians, and that actually benefit our communities. So when we talk about climate solutions, it can't just be, replacing pipelines with solar panels owned by Shell. We need to be looking at, can we have community-owned renewable energy development? We see Indigenous communities actually leading the way across the country when it comes to renewable energy development. We see that with organizations like Sacred Earth that are playing such a critical role in empowering Indigenous communities to take on more leadership in the renewable energy sector. So yeah, I think it's really important to think about how we center justice in the solutions, and that we don't leave climate change behind, because right now it's a really devastating thing that fossil fuel industries are actually succeeding at making people think that climate action is actually hurting affordability, when that's just not the case. We're seeing this in Vancouver. I don't know if you're following, Jim, but like just the Vancouver City Council is trying to overturn the gas ban in new builds, and saying that it's actually a housing affordability thing, because building houses will be more affordable if we have gas hookups in buildings. But that's actually not true. Reliance on gas is actually not an affordable thing for Canadians. And we know that heat pumps are actually more affordable, and they actually are life-saving in the middle of a climate emergency because they provide heating and cooling. So these are really important considerations. Sorry, spoke a little bit long.
Oh, that was excellent. That's yeah. And I think in many ways, this is the real crux of the matter. All of us concerned with climate justice have been pretty dismayed to just see it fall off the agenda. And I think right now, even a lot of progressives are feeling like now is not the time to be talking about it. So we are at 2 o'clock, which is the end of this webinar. And time flies when you're having fun, as they say. There are more great questions in the Q&A, but we've run out of time to address them. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming to the webinar. It's great that people are taking an interest in the work that the Center for Future Work is doing, particularly this false profits project. It is extremely important, and in one of those, it's awful for it to have been so timely that even after the wake of the last bout of high inflation, it's more important than ever because we are now on the brink of a new one to come. So thank you to you both, and thank you to everyone for attending.
Thank you, DT and Atiya and everyone for joining us, and stand by for further research in this whole stream.